I'm on my way to a very interesting new project today, which is at a totally vacant, empty chapel in one of the Welsh Valleys. And coincidentally, it's the valley that I was born in and grew up in, so it's got some sentimental ties to my childhood too. I thought I'd bring you along in the car journey on the way up, just to talk through some of the details of the project before we get to site. So I've been commissioned by the local authority to produce a feasibility study on this chapel. It's been empty for 10 years and it's in a really bad state of disrepair. I think the roof is partially collapsed. The gallery internally has been totally removed, so it's just one big shell. So a lot of the historic features have been lost. The study requires 2 deliverables from me as the architect. So one of them is to produce a fabric condition survey. So the council and the owners of the building would like to know how much is this going to cost to put right and just repair to a state where it's safe. And then secondly, what new uses could be introduced into it that would benefit the community. So this is the line of work I've been focusing on with Initiate for the last 12 months or so. It's something I'm really interested in because, like I said, I'm from the Welsh Valleys, and if you've ever been to the valleys, one thing you'll notice is just the sheer amount of chapels that are vacant and falling into disrepair. And it's really sad because they form a significant part of our social and cultural heritage. So during the Industrial Revolution in the mid to late 19th century, there was a boom of non-conformity in Wales. And that resulted in the construction of a whole range of different chapel typologies throughout the valleys in particular. And they were serving congregations in the local community, many of which were working in the mines and were experiencing real hardship. And these religious buildings really provided a symbol of hope and respite from that hardship. But unfortunately, since the mid-20th century and certainly into the 21st century, there's been a real decline in the congregation numbers to these chapels, and some of them have been left totally empty for decades. And it's now becoming a chronic issue throughout South Wales. If we want to repurpose these buildings, then what can they become and how can it be financially viable to do that? But the biggest challenge with them is that they're often not financially viable for any other use other than conversion into flats. And the fate of most of them is that they're put on private auction and they're purchased by developers. And they're then sort of cut and carved into a whole series of smaller spaces that provide flats, but really just abolish any character or heritage significance that the building once had. And that's something that I'm really interested in exploring. How could we introduce new uses into these buildings in as cost-effective way as we possibly can that retains the significance of the space and the character of the space. So there's not many spaces that we have in the Welsh Valleys that are of this scale, double, triple height, vaulted spaces that have potential for all sorts of creative new uses that serve the needs of the community. So today I'll be visiting one example of a vacant chapel, and I'll show you around its existing condition and talk to you about what I'll be producing over the next few weeks for the local council to explore what the future of this building's going to be. Typically though, it's another rainy day in the valley, so I'm probably going to get pretty wet today, but I've been hanging around for a while to find a dry day, and at the moment it's just rained continuously, so I've got to just get it done. So we're around the back door and the main way into the chapel at the moment, and nobody's been in here for 13 years or so. We've got consent from the owner to break in because they couldn't find the key for the lock. So we've cut our way in, and let's see what's like inside after so long. So interestingly, the last time I came in here I was about 8 or 9 years old, and we used to do Boy Scouts when I grew up in this valley, and there was a full first floor gallery level, and I remember, obviously being a child, I remember it being bigger than this, but it's a really open, large space still. But unfortunately, a lot of the historic features are now gone. You can see just fragments of it, of where things used to exist. So there was a stair running up here that led to a balcony level. And you can see that, you know, this was the pulpit and the altar. And, you know, you preach that way back towards the main entrance. But all of the furniture, the altars, the pews, any sort of timber work is gone. You can see the pockets in the wall at that level where the timber joists would bear into the wall and form the gallery level, and that would span out this way onto posts. And the only real fabric that's left is these, which are, you know, huge timber members that I believe would then span the front of the gallery, and you can see the pocket in the wall there that they would have fed into. I just find it fascinating looking around here. I mean, you can still see in the staining on the wall where the balustrade of that gallery existed, and that would run across at windowsill level right across the flanking wall. Really interesting, but sadly lost. Some of the original windows are still here. They're all damaged in one way or another, but you can still see the fanlight over the entrance doors, and this window is probably the most intact. And what I always find, you know, amazing about windows of this age is that they're just incredibly delicate. You know, really fine glazing bars and thin, delicate glazing sitting within. It's quite surreal being in here, actually. I visit a lot of chapels in this condition, but this one I actually knew of before it got to this state, and I'd experienced it myself. So it's really strange to come in here like this. It's almost like a post-apocalyptic space for me. And it would be great to find ways in which this might be reused, although as you can see there's a lot of fabric repair work to even be able to get it back in a condition where a new use could be considered. But it's fascinating, isn't it? Just imagining the 100 years or so that this would have operated as a chapel and community space. How many people, how many generations have been in this building, and, you know, the memories within its walls. It's what I love most about work with historic buildings. Another surviving feature which we just don't see in contemporary architecture now is wall vents. So here's pretty much, there's one or two of these surviving here, which are cast iron decorative vents that you'd be able to open and close to naturally ventilate the space. So the way these chapels are built is that they got incredibly thick solid stone walls. You know, these walls are probably 700-800 millimeters thick, and they are built with porous materials, so it's local stone bonded with a lime mortar. And the idea is that, yeah, the walls get wet, but they're of a thickness where that moisture is allowed to evaporate before it gets to the interior, because the whole construction is breathable. So my job here today is to do a full fabric condition survey of the interior and the exterior. I'm going to start with the interior because it's raining outside, and I'm hoping this afternoon it'll dry up. So let me bring you along and I'll show you how I approach this. So the way I'll break the survey down is separating it into the building's individual construction elements, so the floor, walls, windows, roof, etc. We start with the floor. Interestingly, at the entrance lobby here, there's original tiles, and I'll put a shot of these up on the screen. They're largely intact, but in areas they have been broken up, but it seems to be the only area in the whole chapel that has an original finish. And then that steps up to the main chapel floor level by about 100 mil or so. And what that seems to be is a thin concrete slab with a build-up of adhesive and a lino tile over the top. So it doesn't seem to be any, valuable historic finish to the main floor. And in areas it's largely broken up. So you might see on the camera here that some areas of this floor have actually sunk and showing signs of settlement. And that's likely because the slab that's been laid over the top of these in more modern times, probably, late 20th century perhaps, is very thin. And the way in which these historic floors were often constructed is they were just flagstones laid onto compacted earth rather than a concrete slab that you see today. And you can actually see that here. There's a thin slab layer over the top of flagstones, and this is just aggregate on compacted earth. So easy to see how the floor could settle over time and then break up that thin slab to form these dips in the floor level. So what we couldn't do with this floor is suggest that it's dug up and a new concrete slab is laid over a damp-proof membrane, because what that would do in a historic building like this is direct the water beneath the ground to the external walls. And these external walls, being historic masonry, don't have a damp-proof membrane like we would have in modern construction. So that can cause rising damp issues in all of the perimeter walls by driving water towards them. So instead, historic buildings like this are built around ideas of breathability. So what we would suggest doing is taking this floor slab up and then laying a limecrete breathable slab system. So that would mean that we'd lay foam glass aggregate nuggets after we've dug this up to form an insulative layer, geotextile membrane over that, and a new limecrete slab. So instead of pushing the water to the external walls, there's a level of absorption allowed within that slab build-up, and the breathability will then allow that water to evaporate. So to provide a record of the floor's condition, I'll sketch out a plan and mark up any areas of settlement and what floor finishes exist. But I'll also put my camera onto the wide-angle lens and stand in the middle of the room and walk bay by bay down the centre of the space to capture the condition of the floor across the entirety of the floor area. So what may seem surprising, but I find unsurprising often with these historic buildings, is that because they're so well built, the stone walls look in really good condition generally. There's areas of damage where the gallery has, collapsed or been taken away, and timber members were pocketed into the walls. But the principal walls in rubble, pen and stone and lime mortar are pretty intact, really, and seem also dry. They seem to be performing really well, given that this building hasn't been in use with heating on for a long time. So we will have to go around these walls bay by bay and capture areas of making good required and areas of repointing required. And there are also remnants of plaster onto the stone walls, which is sort of flaking away, and we'd have to allow for taking that back, inspecting underneath, and then reapplying a plastered surface, or even leaving exposed rubble stone, depending on what the new use will be. There are also signs on the walls where more modern uses have been in here. So when I was here as a Boy Scout, this was a toilet space, I believe, and there's still a waste connection in the floor. And the way in which you can tell it's a modern connection is that there's wall ties into the stone wall here, and remnants of concrete blockwork, which of course wouldn't have been the 19th century material used for the principal chapel space. So similar to the floor, what I'll be doing is going around bay by bay, so taking photographs on the iPad, moving along bay by bay and marking up the photographs with areas of repair required. And with regards to repointing, for the purposes of costing that at the moment, what I generally do is allow for a percentage. So for instance, looking at this bay, you'd be saying, well, okay, 40% repointing in lime, and then move into the next bay, 20%, and you just move along, and that will create a sort of general extent of repointing required internally. So it's worth probably noting that what I'm doing is marking up the architectural condition survey. I actually have a structural engineer meeting me here at 3 p.m. today to run through all of the structural repairs and any key structural hazards. So as architects, we're generally not able to advise on structural works, mainly because of our professional indemnity insurance. So I wouldn't be insured for providing advice on wet rot or timber repairs. That would be a specific exclusion to my insurance, so we always have specialist input where required, and what I'll be doing is marking up all of the architectural fabric repair required. So a large area of the walls to the ground floor level have been plastered in a sand cement render build-up, which, similarly to the ideas of breathability I spoke about with the floor, this is the worst material you can apply to a historic building externally or internally when there's solid masonry walls. So what this sand cement is doing is just sucking all the moisture out of the wall and holding it. And rather than allowing it to breathe, it's just going to sit within that sand cement, and the evaporation time is very long. So the wall will remain saturated for much longer, whereas if it was a lime plaster build-up, that would evaporate far quicker and allow for a breathable wall system. So as part of our repair strategy, we'll want to be taking off all sand cement and reapplying a lime build-up. So moving on to windows, I always find in the historic buildings that we work on, I'm always amazed by the craft that was put into making windows. They were really, celebrating the opening historically. And, in a lot of cases in modern architecture, that's been really lost. So most of the glazing in the chapel has been lost. I think every single pane is pretty much lost or damaged. And this is the only window that remains with any real beauty and intricacy to it. It's made out of painted hardwood with very fine glazing bars, and would have had stained glass in it, so there's some green panes and some clear paint centrally. So what's important for me now is to document the arrangement as much as anything else, because in our reuse options, we'd really love to reinstate windows that are faithful to the original design intent. And we'd want to do that in painted hardwood over aluminium, or certainly no UPVC. There's a delicacy and a softness that can be achieved with painted hardwood that can't be achieved with many other systems. And with today's paint systems and certain hardwood species, they can also be extremely durable. So the same procedure applies to doors. This is traditionally the only way into the space, as this chapel is a lobby entry type. So you would enter in centrally, there would be a lobby that would lead you either side to the galleries or your central procession in. And these seem to be the historic original doors, although there's a lot of wet rot to the bottom of them and the fan light is missing, but at least we can get a sense of what the original intent was for the entrance door and what the fan light may have been. The other way in was done in the 20th century, and that's pretty obvious by the way in which it's constructed. So there's a brickwork coin that forms the opening, and then these concrete lintels bridging over the wall. And what you can actually see in here is where the window would have been, because there's a window on the other side that mirrors this, but this is effectively punched through. So this, may work to our benefit in the sense of this might be the appropriate way in to the space for a new reuse, because that entrance is right onto the main road externally and can be quite dangerous down a steep set of steps, whereas this gives us level access. So onto the roof, and to be honest, this is probably what surprised me the most, given how long this building hasn't been in use for. The principal trusses, the rafters and the purlins, they all seem intact and quite dry, certainly from this level. And there's a roofing membrane and a slate covering which is very locally damaged. You can see through openings in the roof, but generally the floor's dry and we've had a really wet period. So that's done the building the world of good, because if that was slightly damaged or collapsed in, then we'd be looking at an entirely different condition of walls and certainly roof structure. But like I said, we got a meeting this afternoon with a structural engineer, and he may have some different, more detailed thoughts, but certainly from initial glance, the structure seems pretty good. Okay, so according to the phone, light rain stops in 19 minutes, so I think it's a case of hanging around until the rain stops and then we'll go outside. So that rain never did stop, and honestly it's one of the most miserable days. So I'm not going to hang around too much with the camera outside, but what I'll be doing is walking around the accessible elevations and surveying the plinth masonry, the wall masonry, the vents and the rainwater goods, the external condition of the windows. And again, it would be the principle of taking photographs of each bay and marking up any specific repairs. Clearly in here it's absolutely saturated from the rainwater goods failing. and there's no drainage down here, so this plinth wall is getting really wet. Okay, so it's quite difficult to film at the front elevation given that we're right on the main road through the valley, but apart from the obvious things like the condition of the windows, the main defects I'm seeing here are some cracking in the masonry. So there's a diagonal crack in a couple of areas between the upper windowsill and the lower arch, suggesting some potential movement. And also at the very upper level, at the eaves, there's some open joints in the masonry, suggesting some structural spread. So I think I'll discuss that with the structural engineer in detail later on. Unfortunately, the other elevations are inaccessible due to vegetation, so I'll have to just do my best with photographs of those. So I'm going to head back to the studio now and start packaging up the information that I've produced today, and I'm looking forward to showing you through that and also talking through adaptive reuse options. So thanks and see you next time.